Alright, so in the last video, a few days back, we talked about the little bit about the first the makings of how the club got started, the website, and we went into briefly a little bit on the Coke machine. And we want to pick that up because I know a lot of people's interested in that subject, and I think this people will enjoy hearing a little more about the background on that car. So I think where we left off was I was telling them about how the car was actually built. This was 30 years after he raced it in '72. So how did you replicate those things so well?
Well, I think the first thing I wanted to know is if there was a surviving car that I could look at. And the more I searched, the more it came to the realization that there was probably no survivor.
Right.
Bobby Allison Monte Carlo. Because if there was, it seemed like it would be something out there about it in a museum, or either Bobby or Junior Johnson or somebody would have record of it. But the way those cars were raced back then and then handed down to a lesser circuit and a lesser circuit, they just got beat up until they were just unusable and pulps and dragged away in wrecks.
And at the time, nobody realized, well, we need to keep this car Bobby Allison's. It's going to be worth something one day because everybody's going to like Bobby Allison. Well, nobody thought about this kind of thing back then. Mm-hmm. This is the era they were running 57 Chevy convertibles and hardtops still at the local dirt track. So,
right. And
this was a brand new Monte Carlo, so nobody really cared at all about that.
And even though NASCAR was pretty well known back then, the drivers and the teams were just working out of little two-car garages in many cases. So they were just trying to keep their head above water financially in some cases.
Right.
So when it came to be that there was no surviving car, I just had to start looking at photos. There were vendors of vintage photos on eBay. There were magazines such as Stock Car Racing magazine, and there were like newsletters and newspapers and stuff all about motorsports from way back in '72. And then 73 and 74 as well. They would drive older model cars for years. And there were certain issues that came out that really went into detail about how Bobby Allison and his team would build a car. Mm-hmm. There were detailed photos luckily, of how the roll bar was made, how the dash was fabricated, and some of the details about the rear axle and the front suspension and spindles and the motor and also the modifications that were made to the body itself. Mm-hmm. The more I learned about it, the more I knew it was going to be a big undertaking, but it was possible. I started getting really excited about it. And now my car, since it was pulled out of the woods, had some rust issues, and that needed to be addressed first. So I had never really imagined the kind of body work that would eventually take place on this car being possible. But
right.
Leo Koenig from Michigan offered to come down. He knew about the project that I wanted to do to make the Coke machine come back to life. And he came down and helped me put a full roof skin on the car from a donor car.
Right.
Not an aftermarket piece.
Yeah, at that time you couldn't even buy that, in the aftermarket. Or Chevelle either.
Cell panels. And watching him work motivated me to learn how to weld and do sheet metal work After a year or two, Leo came back, helped me with some floor pans, helped me put the rear lip spoiler on that was shown on pictures. Everything was calculated and scaled to from photos to real life dimensions, and just a ton of body work. The radiusing of the fenders in the front, which would allow a very, very large front wheel and tire.
Right.
And even in the rear, it didn't show as much, but those fenders were slightly enlarged, the fender well openings.
Right.
And when you do that, you get a gap where the inner fender in the rear and the quarter panel,
where they're supposed to meet.
right.
Yeah.
So that I had to cut into wedges the inner fender, push them out to the quarter panel. And just the more I done to this car, it seemed like it snowballed and snowballed. So it took many years just to get the body and the chassis right. I looked up and found a 427 block.
Mm-hmm.
Looked up and found a 4-speed manual transmission, the Z-bar, and all of the linkages and stuff to make a big block 4-speed car. And before long, I was getting ready to do the interior, which was no carpet, no door panels. I took some aluminum steel, not aluminum, but yeah, it was aluminum.
Yeah, it was aluminum, yeah.
And this aluminum sheet, I cut it, and I made door panels. I made rear seat panels. I made a rear package tray.
Block off for the back seat.
Right, the block off between
now
the
that
trunk.
leads us to the next thing, the complicated roll cage.
Yes. Guy here in town put the roll cage.
Danny Ritchie.
Danny Ritchie.
That's actually my uncle, believe it or not.
We didn't know it at the time.
We actually didn't know each other very well at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But L.A. roll cages. And wasn't he able to form that bar by looking at the magazine pictures? And that was another thing instrumental in building this car, was having the roll cage correct.
Right. The roll cage was kind of wild for a street car. One thing I didn't want to do that the real car had was completely gutted doors.
Right.
I'm talking about it was only one panel. The outer skin
the
was
outer
all
skin
that they ran. I wanted a roll cage, but I wanted to keep my full door, windows and everything.
Yeah.
So what that did is squeeze the roll cage in a little bit, but it came out looking excellent.
It did.
And it still had the same shape and general idea as the original car. When you would open the door, there was 3 bars up. You had to crawl in.
You almost had to be a contortionist to get into this car. And if you'll check out some of my other videos from several years back, I actually have a video of me and Kevin riding in the car. And you can see me open the door on the passenger side and get in. And there were 2 bars about like that on the passenger side. On the driver's side, it was about that tall. And 3 bars. Mm-hmm. So a little kid could kind of climb over them, but us, being grown and all, it was kind of challenging to get in the car.
Right. So when I put the car together and wired it, I wanted it to have a horn. I wanted it to have wipers, stuff that you needed to be street legal. I wanted the car to have 2 seats instead of 1 because I just didn't feel like it would be a fun car to always be alone in.
Right.
And so, Jared, you helped me a great deal on that car. You were over here every other weekend or so. And you were very interested in the project. And you learned how to do paint and body work on that car.
Yeah, I learned on that car. All your other videos you see me put on, if it hadn't have been for that car, wouldn't say I wouldn't have never learned it, but that car played an instrumental part in in the learning process of the how to do paint and body. And that car was extremely rough. It was a good one to break your teeth in on. Because it had a lot of body work to be done. Over the wheel wells on the fenders, I wouldn't say in places the Bondo, not Bondo, but body filler and fiberglass filler was probably a quarter to a half an inch thick, just so the car didn't look like just a raggedy old race car. We wanted this car to look well.
When the fenders were cut and radiused for the tires, you don't know how much that fender wheel lip that bends in just slightly plays a role in the backbone of that fender. When you cut that out, it just flops.
And you took a piece of steel and actually welded it.
I had to bend it across my knee because I don't have a big, fabrication shop. So I just took a rod and bent it across my knee and welded it onto the inside.
As far as being authentic, 12 bolt, 4-speed, all that stuff, 10-inch, 15 by 10-inch rallies, painted gold, just like the car. What about in the Goodyear tires? What about tell us a little bit about the brakes and the suspension, what you had to do. Because I know the car rode like a 2-horse wagon at times, but it's just the way it was.
Well, this was all just trial and error, but I had read that back then in NASCAR, they would not run disc brakes because disc brakes had a drag on them. And that would cost them a mile per hour or two. At 190 miles an hour, you don't want any kind of drag on them brakes. So drum brakes could be set to 0 drag. So they actually took a car that had pretty much standard disc brakes.
Yeah, Monte Carlo,
especially in '72.
Right.
And took those off and put drums on it. Well, that seems like a step in the wrong direction.
Right.
But in order to get that authenticity and as a conversation piece, I took drum brakes and put them on that car. And the rumor is that the spindles that I put on that car were from an F-body. And we cut 2 coils out of the springs. And when that car sat down the first time with those fenders radiused, and I was afraid that it wasn't going to look right, or that we had taken too many coils out. Things sat down and looked excellent.
Yeah, and I remember seeing those pictures when y'all got the suspension just right on that car. And this was probably a couple of years before it was painted. This project dragged on. The project started basically birthed with the club around 2000. And there was another few things I wanted to mention. You even went as far as the windshield and back glass hold downs. And those were installed after the car was painted. But, made aluminum block-off plates for the taillights.
Right.
And block-off for the door handle area.
Right.
But another thing I wanted to kind of call out here was the headlight covers.
Yeah.
Good story on those.
Yeah, it was George Lyons.
George Lyons.
From California, I think, right?
Right, yeah.
He wanted to have a part in the project, so he sent me fabricated headlight covers that were removable with screws. He made them out of some kind of metal that he got from a computer case.
Computer case, right.
And they just screwed right into the factory holes where the original bezels go. So there were several people that had a hand in. The person who helped with the decals, the big number 12 of the Coca-Cola, and all, Jared, Leo, George Lyons.
Yeah. And as far as those decals, there was a guy that made your decals.
He was out of Wisconsin.
He was out of Wisconsin. And I run into that guy talking with someone here a while back. He said he was the one that actually made those decals.
I am forever grateful for that.
Yeah.
That would have been a very expensive endeavor without him.
And Now, as far as putting Bobby Allison's name on the car, you know, it was a little bit of a concern about that. You might have thought, you know, you may just put Kevin Wiles on the roof.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about how you went about making sure that was all right.
Well, I didn't want to get in trouble with copyright laws and stuff like that or whatever. So, I don't remember how I was able to obtain this telephone number, but I called Bobby Allison. I think I called his race shop or something, or his fan club, which his daughter runs.
Mm-hmm.
And I left a message, told him what I was doing, and Bobby Allison actually called me on the phone
Wow,
back in
okay.
2002 or 3 or something like that. And I asked him a permission, respectfully, to be able to use his name and script for the roof. And he said he would be honored to.
Mm-hmm.
And when I debuted the car, finished, or almost finished actually,
Yeah.
in Indianapolis that year, it was a big hit. Everybody loved it. They were
actually putting decals on at the car show.
Mm-hmm.
And a lady in Alabama, Glenda Bryan, actually helped him put the decals on. I didn't want no part of helping with that. I'm not good with decals. She actually motivated you to get back out there and put those decals on. That was Ronnie's wife.
Yeah, to put the decals on, you put soapy water on and you apply it and you squeegee out the water. So we were out there doing that just hours before the car show.
Right.
And if it weren't for that finishing touch, the car would have never been in Super Chevy magazine.
Yeah, and that's right. It was in Super Chevy magazine. We got to go around the not the Indy Motor Speedway, but where the Super Chevy was the Indianapolis Raceway Park. Mm-hmm. And they actually did the photo shoot on the where the Truck Series raced behind there. So check that out. It's still online on superchevy.com. You can find it. And that was the first, basically, show. And briefly want to mention, later on that year in October, we got to go down to Dawsonville, Georgia, mm-hmm. to the Moonshine Festival. And now there's actually a distillery in the Georgia Racing Hall of Fame down there. And the reason I wanted to mention that, Junior Johnson, of course, owned this car. And they was in a constant feud back in the day.
Right.
And tell us a little bit about that little deal of how that worked out there.
My uncle, just a couple of days before the Moonshine Festival was coming to Dawsonville, let me know that Bobby was going to be there.
The Grand Marshal.
Right, he was going to be the Grand Marshal. So, on short notice, I loaded the car up in a trailer and drove to Dawsonville, Georgia, in hopes of getting Bobby to sign the car and to get pictures with him. And when I got there early that morning, I found out he was eating in the restaurant in Dawsonville near the museum or something.
Right there at the museum, yeah.
And when he came out of that museum, it was like he saw an old friend for the first time in forever, and he was just grinning big. And I'll never forget what transpired that day. All my life. It was a very memorable thing. I got to chat with Bobby Allison about that car and the things he remembered about that car, and the things he remembered about Junior Johnson. And he told me about particular races, and
they won 13 races that year with that car.
He told me all kind of details. The trouble that he had with Junior Johnson that year, he still hasn't gotten over that. He still to this day holds a grudge, and so does Junior, I'm sure. They didn't see eye to eye. And there was a very symbolic thing that happened that day later.
Yeah. We was all lining up for the parade.
Mm-hmm.
And there was some guy in front of us. He must have had something to do with something, but then it was us and the Coke machine.
Right.
And then behind us in a 44 moonshine running coupe was Junior Johnson and someone else.
Right.
And we got to go through the parade. Well, after the parade ended.
So Junior had already signed the Coke machine on the driver's. Bobby had already signed the car on the driver's side cell panel. When we went through the parade, we looked in the rearview mirror or whatever and said, "Look who's behind us."
Right,
we didn't even know he was behind us until we got in the parade. And when we stopped, I wanted to get Junior to sign the car too. And it just so happened that before he disappeared into the crowd, he signed that car on the opposite side, which I think is symbolic because they saw
eye to eye.
Completely opposite.
But
directions.
also, I was there, and I'm glad to say I was able to see this.
Mm-hmm.
Junior didn't hang around and talk about the car.
No,
he disappeared.
He wasn't as friendly, I don't guess you could say, as Bobby, and he didn't want to talk about the car. Probably because of the bad memories with Bobby or whatever. You know, they were only a team that 1 year.
Yep.
And those are two of the biggest legends of NASCAR, and for them to be a team, even if it was only for that 1 year, made it very special. Well, they didn't win the championship that year because Richard Petty was in his heyday.
Right.
But he nearly won it. And
Yeah.
there's a story where the Coke machine lost a lug nut on the last lap, or he would have maybe won the championship, something like that.
And you left the lug nut off
Right.
one of those wheels just for that reason. Kevin, thank you for sharing that story. It's good to always hear a lot of that again. A few things I heard, I'm sure I didn't know. But this will be an interesting video, I'm sure, for a lot of people out there that runs across it that's into old NASCAR and what NASCAR used to be. Sure not the same anymore, but Bobby Allison's and Junior's luckily still with us. This is March of 2019. I think they do come back to that festival in Dawsonville. That's where Bill Elliott, his hometown, is. Check out that Racing Hall of Fame over there if you get through Dawsonville, Georgia. But you can see the Coke machine at several they may have it on display some at the Coca-Cola plant, but it's owned by Coca-Cola now. Kevin sold it a couple years back, but everybody around here kind of hated to see that car go. It's kind of a local legend around here. It drawed a crowd wherever it went. It was sure was the hit of the local cruise-ins, that's for sure. So if you go to any of the NASCAR races, it'll be on display. Daytona, Charlotte, Talladega, it's been at all those events. I've seen pictures online. But anyway, we'll keep on doing this. We'll come up with something else interesting to talk about. But I think this probably will be one of the most interesting things you may hear. It'll be about the Coke machine. So appreciate you sharing that with us, bud.
I enjoyed talking about it.
Yeah.